On the night of February 28, 1918, Major William Joseph Donovan led his 1st Battalion of the 165th Infantry into the front-line trenches near Lunéville in the Lorraine sector of France. He was 35 years old, a Columbia-educated attorney from Buffalo, New York, who had drilled cavalry with the National Guard and chased Pancho Villa across the Mexican border in 1916. The trench system he entered had been occupied by French and German troops since 1914. The mud was 3 years old, the wire was 3 years old, the rats were 3 generations deep. His men were Irish immigrants and the sons of Irish immigrants from New York City, redesignated the 165th Infantry after years as the Fighting 69th, the regiment that had fought at Bull Run, at Antietam, at Fredericksburg, at the Wilderness, and that now found itself embedded in the French 7th Corps, learning how to survive an environment that had killed 400,000 men in the 3 years before they arrived. Donovan's battalion was under fire within 24 hours of entering the line. He would later write to his wife Ruth that he had wondered how he would react under fire and discovered he had no fear of being able to stand up under it, finding it thrilling in the way a youngster finds Halloween thrilling. His battalion's nickname for him, Wild Bill, had been coined before the war, on a training march in upstate New York when he had driven the men through a full-pack obstacle course at 35 years old and finished without losing his breath while younger soldiers collapsed behind him. The voice that coined the name from the back of the column said, "But hell, we aren't as wild as you are, Bill." Donovan publicly disliked the name because it ran counter to the cool, precise image he wanted. The men used it anyway, because it was accurate. The 42nd Infantry Division had been assembled from National Guard units drawn from 26 states and the District of Columbia, stretching across America like a rainbow, in the words of its Chief of Staff, Colonel Douglas MacArthur, who named it accordingly. It was the 3rd American Division to reach France, arriving in the late autumn of 1917 and moving into the Lunéville sector of Lorraine in February 1918. The division's regiments came from New York, Alabama, Iowa, Ohio, Georgia, Wisconsin, Maryland, California, South Carolina, Missouri, and more, a cross-section of the country assembled into a single fighting force. French officers attached to the Rainbow at Rollempont during initial training reportedly thought more highly of its performance than Pershing's headquarters staff at Chaumont did, a tension that ran throughout the AEF between the institutional doctrine being administered from headquarters and the practical knowledge the French were trying to transfer. MacArthur himself had been instrumental in forming the division and was its chief of staff during the early phase. He was 37 years old, West Point class of 1903, a general's son who had served as an aide to President Theodore Roosevelt and who had already begun to develop the conspicuous personal style, the corncob pipe, the braided cap, the refusal to wear a steel helmet in the forward trenches that would define him across 2 world wars. In the Lunéville sector, MacArthur went forward into no man's land on personal reconnaissance missions that scandalized his headquarters staff and made him, in the eyes of the frontline soldiers, something different from the typical staff officer who administered from a distance. The distinction between commanders who understood the ground by looking at maps and commanders who understood it by walking it was not subtle on the Western Front. The terrain knowledge required to plan a night raid that had any chance of returning with a prisoner rather than with a casualty list required someone to have been in that specific piece of ground in the dark. MacArthur obtained that knowledge in person. He was gassed in the Baccarat sector and refused to leave his post. He led patrols into no man's land wearing his officer's cap without a steel helmet, in deliberate defiance of AEF regulations, apparently on the theory that the men who followed a commander who refused to protect his own head would fight differently from the men who followed a commander who administered safely from behind the wire. There is documentary evidence that this theory had operational validity. Soldiers who served under MacArthur in the Baccarat sector described him as someone whose presence in a forward position changed the calculation of what could be asked of the men behind him. By July 1918, he was commanding the 84th Infantry Brigade and had been promoted to Brigadier General. He would later say that he had never lost a man he sent out on a patrol he himself had not first made. Whether this was strictly true in every instance, the men believed it was, which had the same operational effect. The 165th Infantry's first significant combat loss came on March 7, 1918, in a section of woods near Lunéville called Rouge Bouquet. A German shell landed directly on a dugout occupied by the regiment's 2nd Battalion, collapsing the entrance and burying 21 men alive in a position 40 feet below ground. Rescue attempts ran for hours as the regiment dug toward the trapped men. Some were reached, most were not. Among the members of the regiment who watched the rescue operation was Sergeant Joyce Kilmer, 31 years old, a New York Times literary editor, Catholic convert and poet, whose 12-line poem Trees had become one of the most widely reproduced poems in the English language since its publication in 1913. Kilmer had enlisted in April 1917, a few days after Congress's declaration of war, as a private in the New York National Guard. He had declined a commission repeatedly, stating that he would rather be a sergeant in the fighting 69th than an officer in any other regiment. He transferred to the regimental intelligence section and worked under Donovan. He wrote a poem about Rouge Bouquet within days of watching his fellow soldiers be buried alive. In a wood they call the Rouge Bouquet, there is a new-made grave today, built by never a spade nor pick, yet covered with earth 10 meters thick. It was read at the funeral service for the dead and published later in Stars and Stripes. It remains regimental tradition to read it at memorial services for fallen members of the regiment. When Kilmer was killed 4 months later, Father Duffy finished the memoir Kilmer had started. He did not alter the account of Rouge Bouquet. Writing to his family from France, Kilmer reflected on what the war had done to his relationship with the craft that had made him famous. "I have written very little since I left the States, but I have a rich store of memories. Not that what I write matters. I have discovered, since some unforgettable experiences, that writing is not the tremendously important thing I once considered it." He had been under shell fire and watched men die in the rubble of a collapsed dugout. The recalibration was permanent. He had contracted with publishers before deploying to write a book about the war, deciding on the title here and there with the fighting 69th. He would never write it. The institutional story of how American divisions actually learned trench raiding, learned it fast enough to be effective before the war ended, runs beneath every individual account in this script and deserves its own attention. The French instructors embedded with AEF divisions in their early months were not working from a printed curriculum. They were transmitting accumulated knowledge from 4 years of industrial-scale trial and error about how men survive the specific environment of the Western Front and how they impose cost on the men across the wire. What that knowledge contained was precise, verified by blood, and non-obvious to men who had not been in a trench in 1914 or 1915 or 1916. The chasseurs alpins who trained the 1st Division at Gondricourt taught it. The French 7th Corps instructors who worked with the 42nd at Rollempont taught it. The British and Scottish veterans who trained the 28th Division near Nielles-les-Blequins taught it. Each transmission was imperfect, each division absorbed it at different rates, and each had to verify it empirically in the field, which meant men died while the verification was occurring. The core of what was being transmitted was not courage, which the Americans had in abundance and which their French and British instructors frequently acknowledged with a mixture of admiration and concern. What was being transmitted was patience, economy, and the specific technical knowledge of a close-quarter fight in confined spaces, how to approach a German position in the dark without sound, how to cut wire without the snap registering at a German listening post 25 meters away, how to pause for 10 minutes inside the German wire and listen before moving, how to work through a trench-based system, grenade around the traverse, count the seconds, rush the concussion without triggering the whole sector, which approach angles gave you the most cover, how to identify a German dugout entrance by smell before you were close enough to see it, how to take a prisoner and move him without the man regaining enough composure to scream or resist. These were operational skills that could be described in a training manual, and were largely useless until a man had done them under fire and survived the first several times the plan did not work. The divisions that had more time to train were better at it. The divisions that arrived later had less time and paid for the deficit specifically. The 2nd Division entered the Toulon sector near Verdun in March 1918, mingling its battalions with French units in a rotation designed to give each American company several weeks of direct trench experience alongside men who had been fighting in those specific positions for months or years. The sector had a history measured in hundreds of thousands of dead. Verdun was less than 2 years behind the ground the 2nd Division was occupying, and the landscape still carried the history in the form of craters, undetonated shells, and a specific quality of silence at particular times of the day that men who had not been on the Western Front could not immediately understand. The 9th Infantry Regiment and the Marine Regiments of the 4th Brigade learned the sector's rhythms, its patterns of German artillery observation, the reliable and unreliable sections of the wire. They conducted patrols, they repulsed raids. The Germans found, to their apparent surprise, that the Americans were harder to raid successfully than anticipated. The 10th Landwehr Division's official assessment of the Americans in this sector noted that they offered embittered resistance with their machine guns, some even with their bayonet, and that a great many of them died fighting heroically. The marine gunner Horace Talbot wrote home that the Germans who tried to conduct raids found out that this division had no intentions of being caught napping and letting a couple of hundred prisoners fall into their hands. On the night of April 13th, 1918, the 9th Infantry repulsed an unusually strong German raid, a significant enough action that it is noted in the division's official record specifically as a distinct event, singled out from the routine patrols and skirmishes of a sector that was described as quiet by contemporary accounts, but that killed and wounded men every day regardless. The 42nd Division moved from the Luneville sector to the Baccarat sector in April 1918, taking full responsibility for its own portion of the Western Front for the first time, as a complete division, rather than as battalions embedded with French units. In the Baccarat sector, the division developed the trench raiding skills that would prove decisive in the larger engagements ahead. Raiding parties crossed no man's land at night, cut wire, entered German positions, killed or captured prisoners, and withdrew before the German response could organize. Captured prisoners gave information that went up the intelligence chain. The specific value of the prisoner, a soldier who knew which units were in which positions, what the rotation schedule was, what the morale state of his battalion was, what defensive preparations were underway, justified the cost of the raid in terms that divisional intelligence officers could quantify and present to Corps Command. Every raid that brought back a prisoner gave information. Every prisoner gave the division a slightly more precise picture of what was across the wire. It was in Baccarat that the 165th developed the specific character of its night operations. Father Francis Duffy described the regiment's approach in his memoir. They went out expecting to find something, and they came back with it. This was not a description of tactical doctrine. It was a description of attitude, the specific aggression that the fighting 69th's institutional history encouraged, and that Donovan's personal example reinforced. Donovan was regularly the first officer across the wire on reconnaissance missions that protocol reserved for enlisted men. He did not lead from behind the tactical plan. He led from the front of it. When the division left Baccarat in late June 1918, the 165th and its sister regiments had been in continuous trench service for 4 months, and had developed a specific ferocity in night operations that French observers noted with approval and German units noted with something closer to caution. On June 21st, 1918, General Pershing ordered the Rainbow Division from Baccarat to the Champagne region east of Reims, assigned to General Henri Gouraud's French 4th Army. Gouraud was one of the defining commanders of the war's final phase, a one-armed general who had lost his right arm to a wound at Gallipoli, survived, and developed a tactical doctrine that would prove to be one of the few genuinely original strategic responses to the defensive stalemate of the Western Front. His doctrine of elastic defense rejected the premise that the front line should be held at all costs. The front line would be thinned almost to the point of abandonment, turned into what one contemporary account called a mass of death traps, while the main defensive strength was concentrated 4 to 5 kilometers back, on a reverse slope out of range of German field artillery and invisible to German observers. A front line of mines, isolated machine gun positions and sacrifice companies, men assigned specifically to die in place while giving the impression that the trench was fully manned, would absorb the initial bombardment and allow the German attack to advance into empty ground before encountering the real defence. Gouraud had placed the 42nd Division on the most sensitive terrain in the entire sector, the ancient Roman road to Chalon-sur-Marne, the historic invasion route into the heart of France. The New Yorkers of the 165th and the Alabamians of the 167th were the guardians of that pass. The Germans knew the rainbow was in the line. Raiding parties from both sides had been crossing no man's land throughout June and early July, each trying to capture prisoners who would reveal the coming offensive's details. The 42nd's raiding record in the weeks before the Friedensturm is precisely the reason the Allied command knew the German attack was coming on the night of July 14th. captured German prisoners from raids conducted by the 165th and 167th had confirmed both the timing and the objective. On July 7th, a week before the battle, Gouraud issued a message to his army that has survived as one of the defining documents of the war's final phase: "We may be attacked at any moment." You all know that a defensive battle was never fought under more favourable conditions. You will fight on terrain that you have transformed into a redoubtable fortress. Your general tells you you will break this assault and it will be a glorious day. At 11:50 p.m. on July 14th, 10 minutes before the German barrage was scheduled to open, Allied artillery began firing on the German positions. The preemptive strike disrupted German units still assembling for the attack. Rudolf Binding, a German officer whose diary survived the war and was published afterward, wrote of what followed. "The French put up no resistance in front. They had neither infantry nor artillery in this forward battle zone. Our guns bombarded empty trenches, our gas shells gassed empty artillery positions. The barrage, which was to have preceded and protected the attacking German troops, went right on somewhere over the enemy's rear positions. When the German infantry arrived at what they believed was the Allied front line, they found it nearly empty. The few French soldiers assigned to those forward positions were sacrifice companies, men sent there specifically to die while maintaining the illusion that the trenches were held in strength. Their flares and rockets and visible movement had deceived German observers for weeks. They died doing it." When the German attack reached the 42nd Division's main defensive line, it met the full force of men who had spent months in these trenches, who knew every traverse and machine gun position, and who were fighting in depth positions they had helped build. The defensive line from left to right was New York's 165th Infantry on the extreme left, then the Ohio 166th, then the Alabama 167th, and then the Iowa 168th northeast of Soissons. Between the Alabamians and the New Yorkers ran the ancient Roman road to Chalon-sur-Marne. Father Francis Duffy, regimental chaplain of the 165th and the most decorated military chaplain in American Army history, recorded what happened when the Germans reached the New York line in his memoir, Father Duffy's Story. The assault broke at the edge of the trench where it was met by cold steel. It was man-to-man then, and the German found who was the better man. The assaulting mass wavered, broke, and fled. The 69th and the Alabama Regiment had refused to fall back to safety during the fighting. Floyd Gibbons, the war correspondent, recalled after the war that when these two regiments continued to hold, the French General Gouraud said, "Well, I guess there is nothing for me to do but fight the war out where the New York Irish want to fight it." The Germans tried again at 6 o'clock that evening. They were beaten off again. German Marshal Paul von Hindenburg ordered the German Crown Prince to stop the German troops bleeding to death against the French Fourth Army. Germany's final major offensive of the war was finished. The cost for the Rainbow Division during the Champagne defensive and the subsequent fighting was 184 officers and 5,469 men killed and wounded, roughly a quarter of the division's entire strength. A French officer who observed the rainbow in action wrote to his superiors, "The conduct of American troops has been perfect and has been greatly admired by French officers and men. Calm and perfect bearing under artillery fire, endurance of fatigue and privations, tenacity in defence, eagerness in counterattack, willingness to engage in hand-to-hand fighting. Such are the qualities reported to me by all the French officers I have seen." The willingness to engage in hand-to-hand fighting was not a theoretical assessment. When the German attack reached the trench line, the men in it fought with whatever was in their hands, and the 165th Irish soldiers from New York had a specific institutional inheritance from a regiment that had existed as a fighting force since 1851, and that had been killing at close quarters since Bull Run. 5 days after the German offensive collapsed, the 42nd was ordered north towards Château-Thierry to join the Allied counteroffensive. The division attacked northeast on July 25th. The fight at Rouge farm and along the Ourcq river was of a fundamentally different character from the elastic defence of Champagne. This was attack, in open country against an enemy retreating but fighting every step backward. The village of Cergy on the eastern bank of the Ourcq changed hands 7 times during the fighting of July 28th and 29th. The 167th Alabamians and 168th Iowans rushed Cergy, took it, was swept back to the riverbank by machine gun fire from the woods on the left, rallied, rushed it again, and found themselves fighting the 4th Prussian Guards Division. The phrase in the contemporary account is precise. They ran into one of the best divisions in the German army. the 4th Prussian Guards. What this fighting looked like at the level of the individual soldier is what the official accounts leave mostly undescribed, and what the survivors described in fragments that do not assemble into a coherent narrative. The Ourcq River at that point was approximately 14 metres wide and 4 metres deep, swollen with rain. The 165th crossed it on July 28th under machine gun fire from Cergy directly ahead and from Mercy Farm on the flank. The stream ran red with the blood of the rainbow, in the words of the division's contemporary historian Raymond Tompkins, a phrase that has the quality of constructed rhetoric, but that the casualty numbers support as fact. The regiment established a foothold on the eastern bank. Companies became intermixed as the advance fractured into individual firefights across the broken ground north of the river. Men from the 165th fought alongside men from the 166th, alongside French units whose line of advance had crossed the American axis of movement. The tactical plan dissolved within the first hour of contact, and what replaced it was small groups of soldiers making immediate decisions about direction and objective based on what they could see from their current position, which was often not far. When German machine gun nests were identified, the method the Americans used in the summer of 1918 was the same method the French had been refining since 1914, and the same method that raids had taught them to execute at night in the Baccarat sector: fire and movement. One element of the platoon pinned the gun position with rifle and automatic rifle fire, while another element manoeuvred to a flank and came in from an angle where the gun's traverse could not follow. The execution was ragged, expensive, and often successful. When it was not successful, the men died at the point of the manoeuvre, picked off by the gun they were trying to kill, and the next attempt was made by whoever remained. The specific violence of these small actions does not survive well in the record. What survives are the unit designations, the terrain features, the prison accounts, the casualty figures. The individual moments, the 15 seconds inside the German machine gun position with a pistol and a club after the grenade had gone in, were not recorded by anyone present because the men present had things to do besides record them. Donovan's battalion led the crossing and the push north of the river. He was wounded twice during the Ourcq fighting. He led his battalion for 4 days against positions on 3 sides, wounded in the process, declining evacuation each time a medical officer made the offer. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at Villers-sur-Fer, July 28 to 31st, 1918. The citation records that he led his battalion across the river and captured important enemy strongholds, was in advance of the division for 4 days under shell and machine gun fire from the enemy, who were on 3 sides of him, and was repeatedly and persistently counterattacked, being wounded twice. No soldiers in the world were more willing than the Americans to come to close quarters with the enemy and fight it out with bayonets, wrote Tompkins. The difficulty the Rainbow was finding on the Ourcq was in getting to close quarters without being killed or disabled. Rushing through the open up to concealed German machine guns in the hope of frightening the gunners into surrender was sheer suicide. This tension between the willingness to close and the lethal difficulty of closing is the central tactical problem of the AEF's fighting in 1918. It is also the reason that the skills developed in night raiding, which solved the problem by removing daylight and distance simultaneously, were so operationally valuable. On July 30th, 1918, Sergeant Joyce Kilmer volunteered to accompany Donovan's battalion on a forward reconnaissance patrol to locate German machine gun positions ahead of the regiment's advance. The patrol moved through broken ground near the Ourcq. At some point during the morning, Kilmer crawled forward to the edge of a small slope to observe the German positions. When his comrades called to him and received no answer, they approached and found him lying face down, his eyes just over the edge of what appeared to be a natural trench. They turned him over. A single bullet had entered his brain. A sniper had found him before he found the machine gun. Father Duffy recorded the chaplain's response. A bullet had pierced his brain. God rest his dear and gallant soul. Kilmer was 31 years old. He is buried in the Ourcq American Cemetery near where he fell, in France. The 42nd went back into combat on September 11th at Saint-Mihiel, the first All-American Army offensive, where Donovan's regiment advanced 11 miles, retook 5 French villages, and captured 350 German prisoners in 3 days. Then the division was moved 60 miles to the Argonne for the Meuse-Argonne offensive. At the Hindenburg Line in October, at the position called Côte de Châtillon, Donovan commanded the 165th in an assault against one of the strongest defensive positions on the entire front. The other two regiments committed to the assault had been stopped by the intensity of German fire and could not advance. Donovan continued. He told his men something that became part of the regiment's institutional memory. They can't hit me, and they won't hit you. He said this while deliberately wearing his medals and refusing the officer's custom of covering rank insignia to avoid becoming a target for German snipers. He was shot in the knee by machine gun fire. He refused evacuation and continued directing the attack until the situation required withdrawal to a less exposed position. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions at Landres et Saint-Georges on October 14th and 15th, 1918. The total decorations Donovan received made him one of the most decorated American soldiers of the conflict: the Medal of Honor, 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, the Distinguished Service Medal, the French Légion d'Honneur, and the Croix de Guerre. Father Francis Duffy lobbied on his behalf for the Medal of Honor, one exercise of a friendship that lasted the rest of both men's lives. Duffy had earned his own Distinguished Service Cross for actions at the Ourcq, July 28th to 31st, where, under constant and severe bombardment with shells and aerial bombs, he continued to circulate in and about 2 aid stations and hospitals, creating an atmosphere of cheerfulness and confidence by his courageous and inspiring example. General Pershing's citation said that specifically. Duffy himself, in his memoir, described the actions without claiming any particular credit for them. He was doing what he had been doing since March, walking toward the sound of wounded men in circumstances where most men walked away from it. Douglas MacArthur, who was then commanding the 84th Brigade, recommended Duffy for the regimental command at one point during the Ourcq fighting, an unprecedented suggestion for a chaplain never implemented, but indicative of what Duffy's presence in the line meant to the men who knew him. He is commemorated by a statue in Times Square, the only full-scale heroic statue in that particular intersection of the known world, because 50,000 New Yorkers lined the streets for his funeral in 1932, and because the men who had been in those trenches did not forget what it had meant to see him there. Donovan went on to found the Office of Strategic Services in 1941, the predecessor organization to the Central Intelligence Agency. The OSS's doctrine of small unit clandestine operations behind enemy lines, of recruiting from diverse populations, of accepting operational risk that conventional military command structures would not countenance, all of it derived, to a degree that Donovan himself acknowledged, from what he had learned in German trenches in the dark. The man who ran American intelligence operations in the Second World War had learned his trade in the Luneville sector, and at the Ourcq and in the Argonne. The skills he had been taught by French 7th Corps instructors at Rollepont, patience, precision, the willingness to move slowly in the dark toward an objective that might kill you before you reached it, became the founding operational logic of American strategic intelligence. It is not a coincidence. Donovan understood it as a direct inheritance and said so. The 42nd Division returned to the line at Saint-Mihiel in September 1918, and the character of that fight was different again from anything that had come before. Saint-Mihiel was the first battle planned and commanded entirely by an American Army staff, Pershing's First Army, approximately 216,000 American soldiers and 48,000 French troops, attacking a German salient that had been held since 1914. The preparatory artillery barrage lasted 4 hours, then stopped at 5 a.m. on September 12th, and the infantry went over. The Germans had already begun to withdraw from the salient. Their own timetable for evacuation had been disrupted by the American attack arriving ahead of the German schedule, which meant that in many sectors the advancing Americans found abandoned positions, hastily evacuated dugouts, and German stragglers who had not received withdrawal orders in time. In Donovan's sector, the advance was 11 miles in 3 days. The regiment captured 350 German prisoners. The speed of the advance disoriented units accustomed to measuring progress in yards rather than miles. 5 French villages were retaken in 72 hours. Soldiers from the 42nd found German dugouts equipped with running water, electricity, and dining areas, the product of 4 years of occupation, in a salient deep enough from Allied artillery to have permitted a degree of comfort that front-line positions on both sides of more active sectors had never known. The skills developed in the raid, movement in small groups, rapid decision-making at squad and platoon level, the understanding that the objective was what mattered rather than the prescribed route to it, translated directly into the mobile warfare of September and October 1918. The men who had learned to move through German wire in the dark at Baccarat were better equipped than their counterparts who had not for the kind of fluid combat that replaced the fixed trench line in the war's final months. The institutional knowledge the French had transmitted to the Rainbow Division in Lorraine was repaid at Saint-Mihiel and then again at the Argonne, where the fighting reverted to something closer to the trench warfare of 1916 than the open advance of September, and where the specific patience and precision of the night raider was again the skill that mattered most. While the 42nd Division was bleeding on the Ourcq, 12 miles to the northwest, the Allied command was preparing a different kind of attack, one that military historians have since called the decisive turning point of the war on the Western Front. The United States 2nd Division occupied the left flank of the assault force at Soissons. The 2nd was unique in the AEF, the only division that combined regular Army infantry regiments with Marine Corps infantry, its 3rd Infantry Brigade comprising the 9th and 23rd Infantry Regiments, and its 4th Marine Brigade comprising the 5th and 6th Marine Regiments. It had entered French lines near Verdun in March 1918 for trench experience, repulsed a strong German raid on the night of April 13th with the 9th Infantry, and then fought at Belleau Wood through June. By July, it had earned a battlefield reputation that placed it alongside veteran French and British formations, something that could not yet be said of most AEF units. The counter-offensive opening on July 18, 1918, was built on a premise that rejected 4 years of Allied tactical assumptions. There would be no preliminary bombardment, no warning barrage to tell the Germans that an attack was coming. The assault would begin at 4:35 in the morning with a rolling barrage, artillery advancing at 100 metres every 2 minutes, with the infantry immediately behind it. Designed to achieve total surprise, the 2nd Division had to move from its rest area through the Forêt de Retz on the night of July 17th and into position before dawn on the 18th. The march took place in complete darkness during a thunderstorm that turned the forest tracks into rivers of mud. Men had to follow each other by touch, holding onto the belt of the man ahead, using lightning flashes to see. Some units had not reached their jump-off positions when the barrage opened at 4:35 a.m. They advanced anyway, closing the distance to the moving barrage at a run. The approach march through the Forêt de Retz deserves more than a passing reference because it represents one of the more extraordinary physical and logistical feats of the American War. The forest was 12 kilometers deep. The trails had been turned to mud. The division had been given 6 hours to move into position, and the column, artillery, ammunition, engineer units, infantry and full attack equipment, was backed up along roads that could not absorb the volume. Units arrived at their jump-off positions at different times. Some companies were still moving when the barrage opened. The 1st Battalion of the 9th Infantry had companies L and M not in position until 3 a.m. and 4:15 a.m. respectively, less than 30 minutes before 0 hour. The men who attacked at 4:35 had been on their feet for hours in rain and darkness, in terrain that gave no reference points and no margin for navigation error. They attacked anyway, at the prescribed time, into a rolling barrage visible ahead of them in the pre-dawn dark, and the attack succeeded in its first day's objectives. The cost was 4,135 casualties over 2 days. The alternative, a prepared attack with adequate rest and full coordination, would have sacrificed the surprise that made the first day's advance possible. Soissons was a success partly because the 2nd Division attacked before it was fully ready. That formulation contains a specific logic of the Western Front in 1918 that applies to every AEF action in the summer and autumn of that year. The 9th Infantry Regiment, on the right flank of the 2nd Division's attack, had managed to get most of its companies into position before midnight. Company M of the 3rd Battalion, nominally in reserve, advanced with the first wave in the confusion, and by 5:15 in the morning had captured Beaupère Farm, losing 40% of its strength in the process. The Marines on the left were several minutes late getting out of the woods, which meant that the 9th Infantry immediately faced flanking machine gun fire from their uncovered left. The 1st Battalion turned left and fought north toward Vertefeuille Farm, rather than continuing northeast on the assigned axis. Tanks arrived at 5:45 and circled the farm. Elements of the 5th Marines charged out of the woods and helped capture it. Units from different regiments intermixed continuously throughout the 2-day battle, Marines fighting alongside Army infantry crossing into Marine sectors, the chaos of contact dissolving the neat boundaries of the tactical plan within minutes of the barrage opening. The 23rd Infantry on the southern flank met strong resistance at the village of Voscastil, where German defenders had converted the stone buildings into fortresses and placed machine gun positions covering every approach. The 23rd surrounded the village, fought through it in hours of sustained combat, took the town, found many of the German defenders hiding in the extensive cave system carved into the stone beneath it, and captured them there. By midday, the 2nd Division had advanced approximately 6 miles on the first day, capturing 3,000 prisoners, 11 batteries of artillery, and more than 100 machine guns. The advance broke the German line at its most sensitive point of the supply corridor of the Marne salient and forced a general German withdrawal from positions along the river they had held since May. The second day, July 19th, was where the 2nd Division nearly bled out. The 6th Marine Regiment, held in Corps Reserve on the 18th, moved forward from Vierzy eastward toward Tigny. The ground between Vierzy and Tigny was open rolling plateau, waist-high wheat, a series of deep ravines cutting across the axis of advance, stone villages converted into fortresses, and no cover for men crossing in daylight. The German defensive response on the 19th was coordinated and devastating. First Lieutenant Clifton B. Cates, commanding the 96th Company of the 6th Marines, who would in a later war become the 19th Commandant of the Marine Corps, reported from his position after the attack stalled, "I have only 2 out of my company and 20 out of some other company. We need support, but it is almost suicide to try to get it here, as we are swept by machine gun fire and a constant barrage is on us. I have no one on my left and only a few on my right. I will hold." That last sentence, "I will hold," appeared in reports from multiple positions in the 6th Marines sector on the afternoon of July 19th. The regiment's casualties were estimated at 50 to 70% in most of its companies. July 19th, 1918 became the single costliest day of fighting in the history of the 6th Marine Regiment. The 2nd Division's total casualties at Soissons over 2 days were 4,135, including more than 700 dead. The men who survived described the fighting in language stripped of decoration. Lieutenant John W. Thomason of the 49th Company, 5th Marines, who would later become a writer and artist of the Marine Corps experience, captioned a drawing he made of his company's jump-off before dawn on July 18th with the instruction he had received: "Keep on to the left until you meet the Moroccans and go forward." The Moroccan 1st Division was on the right flank of the American attack, one of the elite formations of the French colonial army, its ranks built from Senegalese troops, French foreign legionnaires, North African soldiers, and men from across the French Empire who wore fezes and had been fighting in exactly this kind of assault since 1914. The 2nd Division went forward between the Moroccan 1st Division and the American 1st Division, 3 formations that the Allied command had selected as the spearhead specifically because they were trusted to absorb the cost that the decisive point always requires. The American 28th Infantry Division, the Keystone Division, Pennsylvania National Guard, organized at Camp Hancock, Georgia, in August 1917, arrived in France in May and June 1918, trained first with the British near Niels-le-Blecquin and then with the French at Gonesse, and entered the front line south of the Marne River in the Château-Thierry region in the weeks before Germany's Friedensturm offensive. The British assessment of the 28th in late May 1918 was unambiguous. None of the above troops are fit for the line at present. The training orders prescribed 3 distinct training periods extending through August. The German offensive of July 15th cancelled this schedule in full. The 28th went into the secondary defensive position south of the Marne, still completing the training the British had said it needed. When the German attack collided with the main force of the 28th on July 15th, the fighting became what the division's own history describes as bitter hand-to-hand combat. The 28th repelled the German forces. 4 isolated companies of the 109th and 110th Infantry positioned on the first defensive line suffered heavy losses in the initial German push before the main position held. What hand-to-hand combat meant in a Marne trench in July 1918 was specific and not ambiguous. The German assault troops who reached the American line on the morning of July 15th after crossing the Marne under fire and advancing through 2 kilometers of terrain had been in motion for hours. They arrived at the 28th trench line with their assault momentum partially spent, their coordination disrupted by the Allied counter-barrage that had opened at 11:50 p.m. the night before, and they found Pennsylvania National Guardsmen who had spent the preceding weeks being told they were not ready and who had spent the preceding hours waiting for exactly this. The fighting that followed was resolved at ranges measured in feet rather than meters. The tools were what was available: the bayonet on the end of a rifle in a space too confined to swing a rifle, the pistol at arm's length, the entrenching tool, the fist. Companies of the 109th and 110th on the forward line took casualties that the official records classify as heavy, without specifying the manner of death, because the manner of death in a trench overrun in the early morning by an assault force is not the kind of information that transfers cleanly into a casualty report. General Pershing visited the battlefield after the German offensive had been broken and declared the 28th soldiers men of iron, and named the division the Iron Division, a designation that became the 28th's permanent identity for the rest of the war. The red Keystone shoulder patch the division developed afterward combined Pennsylvania's identity as the Keystone State with the combat name Pershing had given them. German forces in the Second World War, encountering the same division in the hedgerows of Normandy in 1944, would call it the Bloody Bucket for the shape and colour of that red keystone. The name the Germans used in the Second World War was a reference to what the 28th had done to them in the first one. The 110th Infantry Regiment, drawn from western Pennsylvania, bore the weight of the German attack at the designated breakthrough point, the attempt to drive through the Marne sector and separate French and British forces as a prelude to the capture of Paris. The 110th held. The 112th Infantry Regiment attacked Hill 204 near Château-Thierry, a position the Germans had held since May, and that dominated the entire sector. They took it. The 109th Infantry from Scranton distinguished itself in the Marne, fighting in ways that the division's own records single out by name. General Pershing's declaration after the battle used language that the Army of 1918 did not apply casually. The Keystones had earned it by doing the thing they had been told they were not yet fit to do. Captain William H. Amarine, historian of the 167th Infantry in his 1919 account Alabama's Own in France, described the path of the American advance during the Aisne-Marne counteroffensive. The path over which the American divisions passed, driving the Germans before them, is almost completely paved with the names of National Guard units, in a northeasterly direction from the Marne to the Vesle, by the 26th and 28th in the beginning, by the 42nd and 32nd for the greater distance and past the most difficult positions, and at the end of the advance, again by the 28th Division. This is an observation worth sitting with. The bulk of the fighting in the decisive Allied counteroffensive of July 1918, the weeks of combat that broke the German strategic position on the Western Front and began the 100-day sequence that ended the war, was conducted by National Guard formations, not the regular army, not the Marine Corps. Men from Pennsylvania and New York and Alabama and Iowa and Ohio assembled into federal service from state militias whose institutional lineages ran back to the Civil War and, in some cases, to the Revolution, thrown into the centre of the battle that mattered most. The 28th Division went from the Aisne-Marne offensive into the Oise-Aisne offensive and then into the Meuse-Argonne. Its total casualties in the war were 13,980. It took 921 prisoners, and in October 1918, it was one of the formations specifically tasked with the most urgent single rescue mission of the American war, breaking through to the lost battalion. The 9 companies of the 308th Infantry 77th Division, 554 men commanded by Major Charles Whittlesey, had been surrounded in the Charlevoix ravine in the Argonne forest since October 2nd. By October 5th, the situation had the full attention of Pershing's headquarters. The 28th Division was attacking around the pocket. The 82nd Division, under its new operations officer, a colonel named George C. Marshall, was moved to reinforce the 28th's flank. Additional pressure was coordinated from the 1st Division. The intent was to compress the German encirclement from multiple directions simultaneously until one of them broke through. What this looked like at the level of the men attacking through the Argonne toward the Charlevoix ravine was the same thing that the Argonne always looked like: dense canopy, broken terrain, invisible machine gun nests, wire in the undergrowth, and no clear way to know where the German positions were until they opened fire. The 28th Infantry pushed through this environment in weather that had turned wet and cold, along axes of advance marked by dead men from previous attempts. They took casualties they could not replace fast enough. They kept going. The relief force finally reached Whittlesey's position on October 8th. Of the 554 men who had entered the Charlevoix ravine on October 2nd, 194 walked out unharmed. 107 were dead. 63 were missing or taken prisoner. 190 were wounded. The 308th's parent regiment had lost 766 men in the 4 days of attacks to reach them. The divisional artillery that had accidentally bombarded Whittlesey's own position on October 4th, the incident that sent the carrier pigeon Cher Ami, shot through the breastbone and nearly legless, back to the battery commander with Whittlesey's frantic correction, had required the 28th's own coordination structure to prevent being repeated. The friendly fire incident was not a failure of the 28th. It was a feature of fighting in terrain where no one knew precisely where their own men were and where the carrier pigeon was the primary communications technology, because the telephone lines were cut and the radio was the weight of a man. The men who broke through to the lost battalion were Pennsylvania National Guardsmen, most of them. They had been told in May 1918 that they were not fit for the line. They were fighting in the Argonne in October 1918, pushing through machine gun fire in the dark to reach men who had been surrounded for 6 days, and they reached them. The historical record does not preserve the names of the specific soldiers who first made contact with Whittlesey's perimeter on October 8th. It preserves the divisional unit designations and the operational timeline. The men themselves went largely unnamed in the accounts, as the men who did the actual work of the AEF's ground combat almost always went unnamed, visible in the record only as casualty figures and prisoner counts, present in the narrative as the subjects of verbs that describe what formations did, rather than what individuals experienced. These stories do not exist in isolation. They are connected by a logic that becomes visible only when the whole is assembled. The 1st Division learned raiding from the Chasseurs Alpins at Gondrecourt in 1917 and became the most experienced raiding division in the AEF by mid-1918. The 42nd learned from French 7th Corps instructors in Lorraine and applied what it learned in a defensive action at Champagne that broke Germany's last offensive. The 2nd Division's Marines and Army Infantry fought at Belleau Wood through June and at Soissons in July, establishing a combat reputation that Allied command used as currency, placing the 2nd at the tip of the decisive counter-offensive because it was trusted to absorb the cost that the decisive point always requires. The 28th Division was told it was not ready for the line in May 1918 and received Pershing's designation of Iron Division in July. Each division learned by contact with the Western Front, often faster than the institutional framework could account for. The learning was not theoretical. It was tested by German assault troops at 3 a.m, and the results were entered into the record as casualty figures and prisoner counts, and the movements of regimental flags across situation maps. The specific value of the prisoner taken in a night raid, a soldier who knew which units were in which positions, what the rotation schedule was, what the morale state of his battalion was, justified the cost of the raid in terms that divisional intelligence officers could quantify and present to Corps Command. Every raid that brought back a prisoner gave the division a slightly more precise picture of what was across the wire. The 42nd's raiding in the Baccarat sector, and the 2nd Divisions in the Verdun sector and the 1st Divisions in Lorraine throughout 1917 and 1918 were not separate institutional developments. They were the same curriculum administered by different French instructors absorbed at different rates, all pointing toward the same understanding of what the Western Front required. The weapons these men carried were the same as those of the Texans and Oklahomans of the 36th, and the Tennessee Deer Hunter of the 82nd, M1911 pistols, M1917, and M1918 trench knives, Winchester Model 1897 shotguns, whose slam-fire capacity had prompted a formal German diplomatic protest in September 1918, sharpened entrenching tools, improvised clubs, built from trench timber, and deactivated grenade casings and hobnails. The 42nd's Irish soldiers from New York used them in the same dark trench bays the 36 cowboys had used them in, against the same German soldiers who had been trained to expect a specific kind of opponent, and who consistently found something different than they had expected. No soldiers in the world were more willing than the Americans to come to close quarters with the enemy and fight it out with bayonets, wrote Raymond Tompkins. The difficulty the Rainbow was finding on the Ourcq was in getting to close quarters without being killed or disabled. This was the specific lesson the AEF learned over and over in the summer and autumn of 1918. The willingness to fight at close quarters was not the limiting factor. Getting close enough in daylight across open ground against well-sighted machine gun positions was the limiting factor. At night, in the dark, with the element of surprise and the specific tools of the trench raid, the calculation changed entirely. The raid had been the laboratory, the open battle was the examination. Wild Bill Donovan went to France as a lawyer who had been a cavalry officer in a National Guard unit. He came back as the man who knew from personal experience in German trenches at 3 in the morning what individual human beings could be made to do under extreme conditions. He built the OSS from that knowledge, and the CIA was built on the OSS, and the doctrine of American clandestine operations from 1941 to the present carries within it the specific inheritance of what Donovan learned in Lorraine and at the Ourcq and in the Argonne. Joyce Kilmer went to France as one of the most admired poets in America, and came back not at all, his name on a white cross in a French cemetery near where a sniper found him crawling toward a German machine gun position to locate it for the intelligence section of a regiment that needed that information to advance. Father Francis Duffy went to France as the chaplain of an Irish regiment and came back as the most decorated military chaplain in army history, with a statue in Times Square, the only full-scale heroic statue at that intersection, because 50,000 New Yorkers lined the streets for his funeral in 1932, and because the men he had walked among in the trenches of Lorraine and Champagne and the Argonne did not forget what it had meant to see him there. The village of Sergy changed hands 7 times. The 6th Marines lost 50 to 70% in a single day of open country fighting between Vierzy and Tigny. Lieutenant Cates had 2 men left out of his company and 20 from some other company and reported that he would hold. The 28th Division was not fit for the line in May 1918, and it was in the Argonne in October 1918, pushing through German encirclement to reach the lost battalion. The 42nd spent 164 days in combat, 3rd most of any division in the AEF, and suffered 14,683 casualties. The names are specific. The numbers are verifiable. The experience they point toward is not something that transfers cleanly into language, and the men who lived it mostly did not try. They had been in the dark with whatever was in their hands. They had held their ground. They had gone forward. What remained of them came home to places where that fact could not be explained to anyone who had not been there. The weapons survived them. The ground where they fought is still there with its white crosses in ordered rows and the names of the dead on them, and the knowledge, documented, sourced, verifiable, of what those names mean and what it cost to put them there.